Napoleon Bonaparte is dead. It is May 5th, 1821. On a remote island where the once great emperor lived in exile after his defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. The cause of death is said to be cancer. But is that really what happened to Napoleon? For more than 4 decades, a case has been made that Napoleon was actually poisoned to death. Now investigators using the most modern tools of nuclear science are seeking to give a final answer to an enduring question. Was Napoleon murdered? In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, nearly 1,200 miles off the coast of Africa, is one of the most remote places on Earth, the island of St. Helena. It's where the British government exiled Napoleon Bonaparte, the defeated emperor of France in 1815, after he lost the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon had once ruled more than 70 million people and commanded an army of hundreds of thousands. Now he would spend his remaining years on an island of only 47 square miles. He would die on St. Helena at age 51. For some, the story of what happened on this island is a story filled with clues, pointing to conspiracy and murder. Others vehemently disagree. Still, both sides do not dispute the overall course of events, and both would begin their tales with the story of a beautiful young girl named Betsy Balcombe.
We know the story from her memoirs, which when she wrote as a married lady, called Mrs. Abel. And she tells these delightful stories about how she fell in love with the great man.
Betsy was a teenager when Napoleon came to stay temporarily with her family on St. Helena. A confident, spirited girl, she evoked a side of the emperor that had rarely been seen. Playful, childlike. In one famous story, Napoleon showed her a sword used in battle. For Betsy, the temptation was irresistible. She pounced. Grabbing the sword, she told Napoleon he had better say his prayers. Years later, evidence to build a case for Napoleon's murder would come through Betsy, who knew him as few others did.
Well, one thing that struck me about the story that I particularly enjoyed is she says that no painter ever managed to get the likeness of him properly, most particularly his smile and his expressive eyes. And I think that's true. Official portraits and the other portraits, you seem to be looking at a different man every time. There doesn't seem to be any likeness you could set upon other than the hand in the tunic, which says that's Napoleon.
But if no portrait captured his face, no period of history captured this side of him. From the very first months of Napoleon's exile, it became clear that the story of St. Helena is not the story of an emperor. It is the story of a man.
For me, what makes St. Helena interesting, what makes it beautiful and moving, is that we see, of course, the great Napoleon, but we also see the human Napoleon. The man who was sick like any other man, who despaired like any other man. This man who played with children like other men.
After 2 months with Betsy's family, Napoleon moved to the house the British had prepared for him. It was a converted stable called Longwood House. There he was joined by a small, select group of supporters and servants. Grand Marshal Henri Bertrand, who had stood by Napoleon in many battles. Count Charles de Monttalon, who had served as an aide. And Louis Marchand, his devoted valet. Eventually, all would be possible suspects in the murder of the emperor. But in the early days on St. Helena, there was not a hint of what was to come.
At first, Napoleon didn't feel the exile too terribly because at the beginning, he thought he was going to spend just a little time on St. Helena, temporarily, before going on to England. He actually believed that for a very long time.
Napoleon's plan was to use the long days to write his memoirs. And each morning he would recount the decisions made in battle, searching for mistakes, rethinking strategies. About Waterloo, he said, "The plan of battle will not reflect any credit on Lord Wellington. The English won because the French cavalry engaged too early, without orders." This was Napoleon's mission on St. Helena, to frame history as he wanted it to be seen, to create a lasting legend.
The legend on St. Helena is a product of the writings of Napoleon. He shows himself as a liberal emperor, one who wishes to establish the benefits of the French Revolution. This doesn't necessarily represent the state of affairs as they were during the First Empire, but the way Napoleon wished them to be seen.
As Napoleon worked, every day 125 sentries kept watch over the lonely house. In the afternoons, when he went for his daily ride, much to his great irritation, he was followed by a British guard. The possibility that Napoleon might actually escape was never ruled out. He had already escaped from exile in Elba the year before, and today evidence has been found that plots were underway.
I found a very interesting broadsheet in an American library announcing in 1816 that the Emperor Napoleon and his entourage had escaped from St. Helena in a hot air balloon. So clearly in the public mind, people thought it was absolutely a possibility.
It is no wonder that Sir Hudson Lowe, the man ordered to keep an eye on Napoleon, took his job very seriously. Napoleon disliked Lowe immensely, and their few meetings were always contentious. At one point, Napoleon accused Lowe of having orders to poison him. He charged that Lowe was not a jailer, but an executioner.
Hudson Lowe found himself in charge of a very difficult mission. On the one hand, he performed his duty with a lot of pettiness and stubbornness. What is less known and what is less talked about is that Napoleon made life very difficult for Hudson Lowe.
When Lowe gave a new order requiring that a British officer see Napoleon with his own eyes twice a day, Napoleon stayed inside, making the sentries have to work for their view. Closed inside the house, time passed even more slowly. After one particularly long day, Napoleon said, "One needs to go to sleep and not wake up for a year or two." More than a year into his captivity, Napoleon began to complain of pain in his abdomen. He had periods of headaches and chills. But later, he would regain his good health. Were his symptoms signs of illness or of poisoning? That would be the subject of a debate more than 100 years later. In May 1819, Napoleon learned that the leaders of the Allied countries in Europe had voted to keep him in exile forever. He knew then that he would die on St. Helena.
He shuts himself into Longwood, keeping the curtains closed so that he can't be seen. Fires burn all the time. It means it's stiflingly hot. Things gradually slow down as he gets iller and iller.
By 1820, he had a new doctor, Francois Antomarchi, who had arrived from France. At that time, Napoleon had become hugely overweight. He had difficulty walking. He was plagued by coughing and vomiting. The once all-powerful emperor was rapidly failing. He told his doctor, "I do not live, I merely exist."
His last horse ride takes place on the 4th of October in 1820. And if you think, from October to May, it's very short. That's a very quick demise.
On May 5th, 1821, Napoleon died. He was 51. The official statement was that Napoleon died of stomach cancer. His wish was to be buried in Paris, but initially the British government would not allow his body to leave St. Helena. Years later, he would be exhumed and moved to a magnificent tomb in Paris. But until then, he was buried on the island that had become his prison. The story of St. Helena is for many simply unimaginable. How could it be that the great Napoleon would die such an ordinary death at a relatively young age? And why, if he died of cancer, was he so overweight? There is more to this story, some insist. And today, a group of dedicated investigators believe they are discovering the truth. Every day on St. Helena, someone recorded the details of life on the island. In the years after Napoleon's death in 1821, the eyewitness accounts of those who cared for him were slowly published. The last came out in 1955 by Louis Marchand, the faithful valet. In his memoirs, Marchand referred to Napoleon's portliness, a much-discussed feature of the emperor, confirmed by images of him in exile, as a man of ever-increasing width. Shortly after it was published, Marchand's book caught the attention of a Canadian businessman named Ben Weider. To say that Weider is a Napoleon enthusiast is an understatement. His home in Montreal is virtually a museum of Napoleonic artifacts.
This is Napoleon's hat, the original hat, that he wore during the 1812 campaign of Russia. He wore this from Paris to Moscow. See, it's one thing to have a painting or a bronze, but something else to have something that he actually used, you know?
Weider has made his living promoting bodybuilding, and he found the information in Marchand's book to be inconsistent with what he knew from his own experience.
I was involved for 60 years in physical fitness, health, bodybuilding, nutrition, and common sense told me, how could Napoleon die of suffering from cancer symptoms for 5 years without medical treatment, die fat? Just impossible. How do you die of cancer without at least manifesting the symptoms of the cancer?
Weider began an investigation into Napoleon's death. Almost immediately, he came upon the work of a Swedish dentist, Sten Forschuffert, who had studied toxicology and had a theory. He believed that on St. Helena there was a murderer, someone who routinely put an invisible, tasteless powder into the emperor's wine, arsenic, used to make Napoleon very sick. The evidence for the theory had been found in the symptoms of Napoleon's illness, as described by Louis Marchand.
When you put down all those symptoms that Marchand described, and you check them with the symptoms of arsenic intoxication in the modern day book of toxicology, they're identical.
According to Weider and Forschuffert, over the course of his exile, Napoleon exhibited 30 out of 34 symptoms of arsenic poisoning.
Here are the symptoms. I'm giving you the key symptoms, okay? Frequent headaches, general fatigue, disturbance of the sleep rhythm. The feet and lower legs become swollen. Marchand talks about that often.
The list goes on, all adding to a picture of a man suddenly gripped by illness, who then had surprising fits of recovery. The most famous came in October 1819, a year and a half before he died. Napoleon had a sudden burst of energy. What Longwood needed, he said, was an enlarged garden. Everyone was put to work.
All of a sudden, Napoleon is in a tremendously good mood for about 6 months. There's extraordinary remarks in the memoirs of Marchand, where he knocks at the window and says, "Wakey, wakey, get up, time to go working," in a rather sort of strange, rather jolly way.
But later, the illness overwhelmed him again. Why? Could it be that he had been given arsenic the day before? to suggest that hard evidence was needed. And oddly enough, it came from Betsy Balcombe, the young girl Napoleon befriended when he arrived. It was March 1818. The Balcombes had decided to return to England. The story goes that when Betsy came to say goodbye, she asked for a lock of his hair. With that in hand, Betsy said goodbye to the man she loved and knew she would never see again. Almost 150 years later, in 1964, the hair that Napoleon gave to Betsy Balcombe was one of several locks tested at Harwell Nuclear Laboratory outside London. There, in a brand new experimental process, the hair was placed into a nuclear reactor and made radioactive, enabling researchers to determine if the hair contained any poison. The results: Betsy Balcombe's memento of hair was found to have high levels of arsenic, 32 times more than what was considered normal. Later studies by the FBI confirmed the finding. Suddenly, the theory that Napoleon had been poisoned seemed entirely plausible. But an even stronger case could be made if there was a connection between the arsenic in the hair and the dated reports of illness in the St. Helena diaries. And so, because Napoleon's hair had been saved as mementos by many people who knew him, it was possible to find more hair to be tested. This time, measurements were taken of individual sections of hair. The results showed that the levels of arsenic rose and fell.
Because as the hair grows, and if you don't feed a person arsenic, the level goes down. And it'll keep going down to 1 if you leave him alone long enough. But then, if he's feeling well, and you figure, hey, now let's give him another shot, and it shoots straight up.
The hair under investigation was cut on May 6, 1821, the day after Napoleon died. And because hair grows approximately at the rate of 1/2 inch every month, Weider reasoned that it would be possible to assign a date to each rise in the level of arsenic in the hair. One increase in arsenic levels occurred in February. And how was Napoleon feeling in February 1821? The diaries are clear. On February 26, 1821, Napoleon's doctor wrote, "The Emperor had a sudden relapse, dry cough, vomiting, sensation of heat in the intestines, accompanied by burning thirst." For Weider, the correlation between the scientific findings and the eyewitness accounts was proof that Napoleon had been given poison in February 1821. And that left the million-dollar question. If Napoleon was poisoned, who was the poisoner? In the famous painting by Steuben, depicting the scene of Napoleon's death, he is surrounded by his faithful followers who stood by him until the end. But if the theory that Napoleon was poisoned is to be believed, one of these people may have murdered the emperor. Or was it someone who dared not show his face in this room? That would be the most obvious suspect, the British Governor Hudson Lowe. Napoleon had made his life miserable. Had he seen a way to get rid of his nemesis? Despite the bad blood between Lowe and Napoleon, poisoning theorist Ben Weider argues it makes little sense to suspect Lowe for a simple reason. The person who did the poisoning had to be someone who had access to Napoleon's food. It had to be someone on the inside, who was there from the beginning. Who in this group of seemingly loyal supporters would have had a reason to murder Napoleon? Could it have been his valet, Louis Marchand?
Marchand was there during the entire period, so he could be a suspect. But Marchand was known by every historian, for and against, as being a loyal person. He was the major domestic who served Napoleon like a son.
Perhaps it was General Bertrand. It was known that his wife wanted to leave St. Helena, Could he have been creating Napoleon's illness as a way to get them all back to Europe?
Bertrand was a very loyal officer who served Napoleon all the way through his entire career. Nothing even points to him being a devious person.
With the other suspects eliminated, there was just one person left. Count Charles de Montholon. And that is who Ben Weider believes fed Napoleon the arsenic. Why? To begin, Montholon had opportunity. At Longwood, he served as the sommelier, the wine steward who had direct exclusive access to the emperor's wine.
When Montholon wanted to poison Napoleon at a certain time, all he had to do when he went down to get the bottle of wine from the barrel, just put a little powder in there.
But what would be the motive? According to Weider, one was that Montholon's stepfather was a friend to the reigning power in France, the Bourbons. It could be that Montholon was a royalist sympathizer, hired to make sure that Napoleon never returned to France. He was just the right kind of man for the job.
Montholon was a fast-moving guy, liked to spend money, he liked to be with women, he liked to go to the races and so forth. And so they asked them to go along and to make sure that Napoleon did not return.
Adding to the list of motives for some historians is jealousy. Today it is widely understood that Montholon's wife, Albine, and Napoleon were having an affair. On St. Helena, she gave birth to a daughter she called Napoleona, who many believe was Napoleon's child. But the final motive may have been simple greed. In the last weeks of April, just before he died, Napoleon wrote out his will. And it was Montholon who made out better than all the others, receiving 2 million francs. It may be the best explanation for why a high-living man like Montholon decided to follow a defeated emperor to the ends of the earth.
Now, Napoleon could have lived at least another 25 years. I mean, why would he want to spend 25 years on the island of St. Helena, okay, living with Napoleon, if he didn't know that after a few years he would be gone?
For Ben Weider, the case was closed. He had established the opportunity, method, and motive for the murder of Napoleon. But on the other side of the ocean, a furor has been building in the city of Paris. This is Napoleon's city. His presence hovers over every corner. The centerpiece of the city recounts his battles. Street names reflect his victories. And his enormous tomb draws thousands of visitors each year. Many Parisians are not happy with the story that their emperor was murdered. They don't believe it, and they want the world to know why. To begin, they argue that a basic misunderstanding of history has been made.
In reality, when you look at the facts on the political level, there was absolutely no interest in killing Napoleon. If Napoleon had come back to France, he wouldn't have been welcome. At the time of his death, we were in the middle of the period of the Black Legend in France, which is to say, Napoleon wasn't loved anymore, and no one was asking for his return.
Furthermore, the historians argue the records from St. Helena are vast and available. The papers of Hudson Lowe, correspondence between those with Napoleon and others in France, and of course, the detailed memoirs of those on the island. All of them have been researched and scrutinized again and again.
What is history? History is to study the past, but not to study it according to our gut feeling, to our personal feelings, but to study it with the tools of a historian. And the tools in this case, in the case of this time period, are the documents. Well, there is nothing in them that even hints at the poisoning theory.
But what about Count de Montholon? Weren't his actions suspicious? The historians have to admit Montholon's reputation was far from stellar. He was even charged with stealing money from his own regiment.
He was well known for being very eager to please, slightly haughty from time to time, but certainly an intriguer. Some have described him as a liar, menteur. A slippery character, difficult to pin down.
But did this man, who appeared to care so strongly for the emperor, actually plan and carry out his murder? Was he really working for the Bourbon monarchy? The best evidence would be that he received some reward when the job was done, and he returned to France. But in fact, when he got home, he was rejected by the Bourbons and remained loyal to the Bonaparte cause. In 1840, Montholon was even sentenced to years in jail because he supported an attempted coup by Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III.
It's hard to explain why Montholon would go with Napoleon III if he was in the service of the Bourbons, if he'd entirely dedicated himself to the Restoration. Doesn't seem to make sense to me.
The final reason Montholon might have had to get rid of Napoleon was that the emperor was having an affair with Montholon's wife. This could be a simple tale of love and revenge. But Napoleon was not an ordinary rival, making Montholon's reaction a bit unusual.
There has been speculation, and people, I think, finally have come down to the conclusion that he knew about it and was quite proud in that slightly, perhaps, ancien regime way. We find that difficult to understand, but in a way it's a compliment on behalf of the emperor towards Montholon's wife.
For Ben Weider, the comments of the historians in Paris are no surprise. They have never supported his theory, but he feels there is hard evidence that cannot be dismissed.
There was an awful lot of arsenic in that hair.
The arsenic in the emperor's hair. If it was not fed to Napoleon, how did it get in his hair? That is a question for some of the most advanced instruments of science. In 1862, 40 years after Napoleon died, one of his former aides was quoted saying, "I have seen so many locks of hair purporting to belong to the emperor, I could have carpeted Versailles." Little did the man know that 140 years later, Napoleon's hair would be at the center of a large scientific controversy. Since 1962, more than 30 tests have been run on the emperor's hair, and almost all have found that Napoleon's hair contains high levels of arsenic. And despite huge advances in technology, no one has been able to say conclusively how the arsenic got there. Many theories have been proposed. One suggestion was that there was arsenic in the green dye in the wallpaper in the bedroom at Longwood, and that Napoleon, who spent so much time in the room, had breathed in the poison. Others have considered the idea that Napoleon used hair tonic containing arsenic, or that he took medicine that contained the poison.
This is actually the original hair that comes from the Grand Marshal Bertrand.
But Ben Weider, the most ardent supporter of the poisoning theory, keeps trying to prove his case.
In here, I want to be very careful with this. There it is. And think back a little bit. This was on Napoleon's head. Yeah?
In December 2002, he brought yet more hair to a new lab. This time, he chose a lab in Strasbourg, France. The legal medical institute that specializes in forensic toxicology. There, toxicologist Pascal Kintz worked with 5 strands of hair, which were placed into an atomic absorption spectrometer that measures the concentration of arsenic atoms in the hair. The results were more of the same.
In the hair of Napoleon, the range of concentration was 7 to 35 nanogram per milligram. That is largely higher and demonstrate exposure to arsenic.
Having confirmed what previous tests had shown, Kintz took the research another step by examining the hair at the University of Luxembourg, where Napoleon's hair was compared to hair that had been soaked in an arsenic bath. The tests were run through an ion mass spectrometer, allowing scientists to get a picture of the arsenic inside the hair. What they found is that the hair contaminated in the arsenic bath contained arsenic largely in the exterior or cuticle of the hair, but Napoleon's hair had arsenic in the core or medulla of the hair. For Kintz, the results were conclusive.
At this time, I am sure that he was exposed internally to arsenic. To have the medulla with such a concentration can only be observed with internal ingestion and via the bloodstream.
While it may seem that this offers real proof that Napoleon was poisoned, Kintz is careful to point out that it does not.
With hair analysis, you cannot demonstrate poisoning. Poisoning means intentionally. It means there is a poisoner. It's not my task to find a poisoner. It's not my task to explain why Napoleon was poisoned. What I can say accurately is that the hair corresponds to somebody that has been exposed to arsenic, and that the concentrations that we measured are very high.
And what of the correlation between the levels of arsenic and episodes of illness? Kintz believes that because hair growth rates are so variable, a calendar of contamination may be only coincidental. And he argues there are many ways in which the arsenic may have gotten inside Napoleon's hair besides poisoning.
Another possibility would be contamination of water or food, not necessarily intentionally. There have been different theories about the wallpapers, corporal, because the emperor was always cold. I don't know.
It would seem that Kintz's research would have at least narrowed the possibilities of sources for the arsenic, but for many it has not. That's because while Kintz was working on his study, toxicologists at the Paris Police Department were at work on a different study of 19 strands of Napoleon's hair. In the police study, the researchers examined the hair with a process called fluorescence X synchrotron radiation, which uses a linear accelerator to produce an image of the hair as if it were being seen through the world's most powerful microscope. Once again, the study found very high levels of arsenic, some so high that Napoleon would have died if the arsenic had been ingested. But one of the most intriguing results came from the choice of hair that was studied. The Paris police study examined hair not only from St. Helena, but also from 1814, when he was in exile on the island of Elba, and also hair from as far back as 1805, when Napoleon had just been crowned emperor. Arsenic was found in all the hair.
The hairs from 1805 contain 10 to 11 parts per million, which today would be considered to have the possibility of causing chronic poisoning. The hair of 1814, when Napoleon was on Elba, contained 60 parts per million, which is a very significant quantity and could lead to acute poisoning.
Now, to believe the poisoning theory, one would have to believe that Napoleon was being fed arsenic over a period of 15 years, long before he even met Montholon. Ben Weider thinks that's possible.
Because they've been trying to assassinate Napoleon for a long, long, long time, going all the way back to Austerlitz and before Austerlitz. He had some symptoms of arsenic intoxication.
For the researchers in Paris, the arsenic in Napoleon's hair is still a mystery. Their research indicates that the arsenic contamination may have been external. And as they consider the long list of possible sources of poison, they agree that one is most credible. It is an idea proposed by Philip Corso, a medical doctor who has been a long-standing opponent of the poisoning theory.
We found out that people in the old days, mothers, Victorian mothers, very frequently gave a locket of their hair for their children. And what they did to prevent this hair by being destroyed by ticks and so on was dust it with a little bit of arsenic to preserve it.
The idea that the arsenic may have been routinely used as a means of conserving hair after it had been cut may explain one more finding of the police study. That is, that when the police toxicologists examined the hair of Napoleon's 3 sisters, all 3 had elevated levels of arsenic. But if Napoleon had not ingested arsenic, why did he have all those symptoms of arsenic poisoning? Critics of the poisoning theory answer that while Napoleon did suffer from many of the general symptoms of arsenic poisoning, he did not suffer from those that are specific to it, which include changes in the skin and hands and feet.
You get what they call black feet. Your feet turn black when it's bad. And you get very thick skin of the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. You also get a loss of sensation, particularly of your feet and then of your arms, and then you get a loss of muscular activity.
To see what a dramatic example of chronic arsenic poisoning can look like, one only has to look at the tragedy underway today in Bangladesh, where millions of people have been ingesting arsenic in groundwater. Tens of thousands of people present a textbook picture of the effects of the poison.
These people show clinical symptoms and signs that are very, very obvious to everyone. Not a single one of the signs that were present in the Bangladesh people were present in Napoleon, who had perfectly clear and ivory white skin.
But if he wasn't killed by arsenic, what killed Napoleon? Cancer? Or some other poison? In the last months of Napoleon's life, faithful aides kept careful watch over their dying leader, writing down every ailment, every movement, and every whisper. On April 3rd, Dr. Antomarchi writes, "Profound sadness, pulse weak and irregular. The patient sweats, is thirsty, and says he cannot eat."
Napoleon knew he was dying. He's quite aware of it. He spends a lot of time in the first months of 1821 talking about his death.
Many believe that Napoleon was suffering from multiple health issues, perhaps hepatitis and tuberculosis, among others. In the end, the cause of death was listed as stomach cancer. Jacques de Costanzo is a gastroenterologist, a stomach doctor from Marseille, who has studied the autopsy reports. From those documents, he learned that Napoleon's doctors found a mass in his stomach the year before he died. At the end, Napoleon was losing weight. He also had lesions that were very familiar.
When you operate on a patient today and find the same lesions described by Dr. Antomarchi in his autopsy report, we always find that they are caused by cancer. For me, the cause of his death was cancer of the stomach with complications, perforations and bleeding, which caused a multivisceral failure, and the death of Napoleon. There is no other explanation possible.
But Ben Weider, who has long promoted the poisoning theory, has a different idea. He believes that in the last days of his life, Napoleon received a final dose of poison, and it was not arsenic. He argues that the arsenic given to Napoleon over the course of many years was the first of a two-phased plot. It was designed to weaken Napoleon and make it appear that he was suffering from a real disease. The second phase, the lethal phase, began in the month before he died. At that time, diaries showed that Napoleon was offered an orange-flavored drink called Orgeat.
Orgeat in itself is inoffensive, but if you mix the oil of bitter almonds to give it a little more spike, a little more taste, it becomes toxic. Okay? It becomes what in itself prussic acid.
Later, Napoleon's symptoms worsened, and one of his doctors recommended a large dose of a medicine called calomel.
Calomel is a relatively old product and has not been part of French pharmacopoeias since 1954. It was canceled, but at the time, it was given for a lot of diseases, and most notably, digestive diseases.
On May 3rd, Marchand was told to give the emperor the calomel, which contains a chemical called mercury chloride. Weider believes that the combination of the calomel with the Orgeat created a poison mercury cyanide that finally killed Napoleon.
And what is the interesting part is at the very end, the doctors had a meeting, and encouraged by Montalon, they gave him 10 grains of calomel, which is about 40 times above the normal dose. So, of course, within 2 days, he was dead and gone.
And that is how the alleged murder was accomplished, with the aid of doctors who prescribed the final poison. But while many reject the idea of a conspiracy to murder, many do question the decision to administer the calomel.
What we know about calomel is that in small doses it can have therapeutic effects, but in high doses it can become toxic.
I think that Napoleon died as a consequence of a cancerous ulcer of the stomach aggravated by bleeding, aggravated by a dose of calomel. But I feel, and I think everyone who's studied it would say that if he had not been given the calomel, Napoleon would have died of cancer of the stomach in a matter of months.
For those standing by, all that mattered was that they were losing Napoleon. They stayed with him around the clock, working to make him comfortable. Finally, the day came, May 5th, 1821.
He was lying in bed, his eyes open but glazed. He looked like he was thinking. He was very calm, very quiet. From time to time, every sort of 15 minutes, there would be a sigh. At one point, a tear rolls down from his left eye. And as the day goes on, his eyes gradually closed, about 3/4 closed. And they wait. And they wait. And then at 5:49, he breathes his last. A cannon fires at 5:50 to say that he's gone.
At that moment, no one would have predicted that more than 175 years later, Napoleon's death would still be debated. Today, it is clear that those on both sides show no sign of giving in.
The facts are too clear. Too clear. Too many factors shows that he did indeed die from poisoning. It would be stupid to believe in anything else. And I'd be the first one to change my mind if I got some absolute good proof.
I think that the poisoning theory is finished. It's in its last throes. Everybody has understood that it's not serious. So it's time for Napoleonic historians to go back to the real problems. Political studies, social studies, economic studies, the legend of Napoleon, which was created at St. Helena.
Why has the debate about Napoleon's death persisted? The answer in part may be that, for many, it is inconceivable that the Emperor Napoleon would die a natural death. There is to this day a refusal to accept the story of St. Helena as the story of Napoleon as a man. Ironically, that is perhaps because Napoleon's mission in exile to create his own legend was so successful.
What we can say is that the death of Napoleon was not an ending. It is a beginning, the beginning of his legend. It was then that the Napoleon we all know today was born, a liberal emperor, a sort of son of the revolution, and it was at this moment that the legend developed.
In the end, on St. Helena, Napoleon became a man much larger than life, and therefore, a man whose death would never be easy to explain.